Stephen Pearce stepped up to the plate and he took an interview with Owen Bradley of Ramstv. I am a little bit disappointed that it wasn't with BBC Radio Derby. Obviously Ramstv, funded and owned by the club. It's obviously going to be a little bit of a PR masterpiece, but it's one of those which we have to get into. I've gone through it so you don't have to, and there is some interesting points to get across from this interview with Stephen Pearce. And I will be completely honest, it did feel like throughout the interview there was a lot of PR waffle, but there was also a lot of talk about what happened in the January transfer window, why they waited to sack Paul Warne instead of doing it earlier on in the season, and why they went for John Eustace. There's also some really interesting talking points about the Sporting Intelligence Unit, the future of a director of football or technical director, and also why there is no footballing expertise on the board. There's also a little bit of news regarding takeovers / investment. We spoke a little bit about that in a video yesterday, so make sure if you haven't done so already, you go ahead and check that video out. But shall we get straight into it? So obviously Stephen Pearce was asked a question about why he's waited until now to come out, of which he discussed how there was always going to do a post-transfer window interview, but obviously with then the sacking of Paul Warne, they wanted to wait for a manager to be sorted to be able to give full context and discussional situations, really, because it's really hard to talk about a new potential manager, an old manager going out, when those decisions haven't quite been made. Now, he made it clear that Eustace was always the number one target, which I sort of felt was quite an obvious thing by the way that we moved so quickly to go and get him, and that was always related to his track record at QPR, Birmingham, and obviously Blackburn. You go to Birmingham, got them out of relegation trouble, turned them into a playoff competitor before getting sacked for Wayne Rooney, who obviously then essentially took Birmingham City down. You then obviously go to his situation at Blackburn, which was kind of similar, was in a relegation battle, kept them up, and then obviously pushed them on to a top 6 club. And it's one of those for me where I'm not surprised by the deal to bring in John Eustace. Record speaks for itself, as Stephen Pearce acknowledged himself. It was sort of quite an easy decision to sort of go for Eustace based on all of that stuff. And when he was talking about the sacking of Paul Warne, he often referred to the fact of performances and results spoke really for themselves, and as much as it was disappointing for a lot of people within the club and around the club, it was sort of one of those which really, when you look at the intricate details of performances and you look at the results and where we are in the league table, it sort of felt as if it was necessary. Now, he spoke consistently across the course of this part of the conversation about the need for succession plans, and that related not just to manager and coaches but also to players on the field as well. He went in to talk about the decision that ended up leading to Erin Cashin moving on, as well as obviously the decision to move Paul Warne on. And they weren't expecting an approach from Brighton until the approach obviously came in. They weren't aware of any interest, but it was one of those where they already had a succession plan in place. The likes of Sondre Langas, they'd apparently been looking at since the summer, as well as Lars Jørgen Selverson, which they spoke about within the window as well. The decisions to let go of James Collins, Sonny Bradley, obviously Tawanda Chiwa, and obviously then Erin Cashin with obviously further injuries as well. They were all discussed, and it was always about having a succession plan. Jørgen Selverson was essentially the succession plan for James Collins. Matt Clark was the succession plan for Erin Cashin going out the door, Langas for Nelson's injury. You obviously then not really got a succession plan for Sonny Bradley, but you probably put that down to a Jake Rooney stepping up or something along them lines. They did talk about, when talking about the January transfer window, about that sort of need for a right back with Ryan Niambi's injury, which once Niambi progressed and sort of got back within the squad, they sort of put that to the back burner. But then obviously Kane Wilson went down injured, which sort of put it back on the agenda, but they weren't able to get anything over the line. They also spoke after that in a little bit more detail about the decision to sack Paul Warne, and they didn't want Paul Warne to take that Norwich match and have his family in the crowd and things like that, and then have it be a sacking afterwards because of the personal affinity that Paul Warne and his family all have to Norwich City. They didn't want to sort of affect that, and they wanted to do things in the right way. And there was a lot of talk about the sacking, that they were apparently sacked on the bus, rumours that they were pulled off the bus to then go to David Clouse's house to be sacked. And according to Stephen Pearce, that wasn't true. It wasn't as quick and close to them leaving as it was suggested, and he was told to head up to David Clouse's house, where Stephen Pearce and David Clouse were together with Paul Warne and Richie Barker, and the decision was given face to face, and it was way before they were set to travel down to Norwich City, which personally, I believe they did the right thing delivering the news face to face. I think they probably should have done it at the training ground. I believe Paul Warne and Richie Barker opted not to go back to the training ground after the decision had been made to say goodbye and things like that, according to what Stephen Pearce said. But it was one of those where Andy Warrington and Matt Hamshaw were made aware quite quickly and were told that they were going to be taking over for at minimum the Norwich game if they were willing to do that, to which both of them agreed that they were happy to. In my opinion, I think that was the wrong decision. I would have let all four go and given it Bucko or Bradley Johnson to take the game for Norwich City and obviously Oxford United. Obviously this then leads into further talk about the transfer window. It was discussing how they wanted more in the transfer window, in not just midfield, up front, in places like that, but across the entire board essentially. But it fell down to a domino effect that didn't work out, and ultimately I personally call bullshit on that. If we wanted a player, we could have gone out and got a player. I think it's a case of although he claims we're not trying to do a moneyball situation, it feels as if we are trying to be really strict with our money and really careful in what we do. And I think he mentioned about having 3 players lined up on deadline day, maybe 4, of which all 4 fell through because the parent club opted not to let them go for whatever reason that was, whether it was they didn't bring someone else in or they just then decided it just wasn't the right call for them. And that's okay. Like, I understand those situations happen, but I just think if you want your man, you go out and get your man, and you've got to stop with letting sort of other people sort of dictate. Obviously not overspend or anything like that. You've got to be smart, but you've got to bring someone in. With the situation we were in, we had to bring players in, and we've ultimately failed to do that. He did say that him and the sports intelligence unit essentially were happy with the business that they've done, but obviously they did want more, whether it be positional or extra bodies in the squad. They wanted more players to add to the unit, and ultimately, obviously, as I mentioned, those 4 players which they were talking about to potentially bring in on deadline day ultimately didn't sort of come through. And as much as it's obviously really disappointing to not be able to bring those players in and to lose it in the way that we did, but I do feel that we didn't necessarily have the backup plans, and that maybe was target 1, 2, 3 and 4 that we all sort of had set in stone. But if we'd have obviously known that those deals were set to be something needs to happen for us to do it. So in my opinion, we should have then potentially lined up other deals that would have been sort of, right, all we need to do is get a medical done and sign the paperwork and it's done, but there's no guarantees it will be done depending on this deal going through, sort of thing. And that's something which I think Derby County have often sort of done wrong. They don't have the backup plans and they don't have the contingencies to, if a team doesn't let a player go, for us to then bring in a player, which in my opinion is ultimately why we ended up with Harrison Armstrong. Obviously the names Carlon Grant, John Swift, was it Danny Gomez or Tammy Gomez, ultimately were 3 players who we looked at. Dan Barlaser was another one who ultimately didn't go over the line. Now we go into a little bit more of behind the scenes talk where they were talking about the board level, talking about the sports intelligence unit and things like that. Now there was talk about Ed Smith and Mo Babbitt, and ultimately they're nothing to do with the footballing side of things, which is fair enough. It's exactly what I thought they'd been brought into. They've been brought in to set up a process, set up a way of analysing data, setting up the tools and making sure the tools are being used right, not necessarily to use the tools to analyse performance or potential transfer targets or anything like that, which it wasn't much of a surprise to me that that's what Stephen Pearce said. That's exactly what I anticipated of them. There was talk around a director of football or technical director, and they basically said that we're not looking at that, which ultimately that's a broken promise that's come from David Clowes. He said on his opening letter that that's something that they'd be looking into, but ultimately this again falls into that sport and intelligence unit. We have a head of talent identification, which is Mark Thomas. Obviously when he came in he was head of recruitment, but once this new role, which I'm going to discuss in a moment, comes in, his role will then change. They've brought in a head of sports science and medicine, which then goes into this sport and intelligence unit. You've obviously got Mo Babbitt and Ed Smith, who are leading the sport and intelligence unit processes, but not necessarily leading the unit itself, which I think is a bit stupid. I think you need someone to lead the unit and lead the processes. But then they want to add in the addition of a head of talent acquisition, which I don't necessarily disagree with. That will be essentially the person who goes out and makes all the deals, makes sure the players are good enough to add something to Derby County and improve the playing squad, whether that be in a depth position or whether it be in a first team capacity, whether it be we go out and sign a Ryan Kent because he's got better performance than Mendes Lang or things like that. His job would be to make that deal work so that Derby County are moving forward in the correct way, making the correct decisions for the right funds. And obviously he would work hand in hand with the head of talent identification and obviously the head coach to obviously put forward those players and go, this is what we need, this is why we need it, and this is how we need to get it. And I do think that having a head of talent acquisition would be brilliant, but I do believe that having a head of talent identification, having a head of talent acquisition, having a head of sports of medicine, I don't necessarily believe that that takes over having a director of football or a technical director that sort of is in control of the whole footballing side of things. I don't necessarily disagree with Stephen Pearce running the day-to-day of the club and making sure everyone's doing what they're doing, but I do disagree with the fact of not having someone of footballing intelligence running sort of the footballing side of things, which is where I think Derby County are a little bit lacklustre at the moment. We then go on to a decision about chairman and footballing expertise on the board, and apparently that all falls down to the discussions that are going on behind the scenes about investments and takeovers, and it's sort of a decision where David Clowes and Stephen Pearce don't want to put someone in that position where we could get taken over in the next 6 weeks and their job is then swapped. They're not wanted anymore. And I can understand the decision on that one. Personally, I understand not having a chairman for that reason. Personally, not quite sure why we don't have any footballing expertise on the board, but again, they related that to the investment, the takeover, and obviously the sport and intelligence unit, which ultimately I do think that I think we're a lot closer to a takeover than we actually know. Obviously, Stephen Pearce made it clear that there was nothing to report, but conversations are still going on behind the scenes, and that doesn't surprise me. I'm assuming conversations have been ongoing since David Clowes put out that statement back in, what was it, September, as the transfer window closed, saying that he's open to investment and things like that. And I do believe that we're in a situation where it's going to be league status dependent, and it's going to be like, I think it'll be investment in League One if we go down. I think it'll be a takeover if we stay up. And I think there'll be different groups taking on different parts should that happen. And it's obviously going to be interesting to see what does happen with that. And these are sort of like the main takeaways which I've took from that sort of half an hour interview with Stephen Pearce. And I don't necessarily think we got a lot out of it. I think we learned a lot about the sport and intelligence unit, but nothing that shouldn't already be basic knowledge. Obviously, the head of talent acquisition is something new for us to talk about, but not necessarily something which is going to really make much difference given the circumstance of not having sort of a director of football, a technical director to sort of lead them in the way to go, in my personal opinion. Obviously, you lot can all have yours. And if you do have your opinion, let me know it down in the comments. I'll make sure to try and get to every single one of your comments. If you have not done so already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on that notification bell, hit the like button as well if you have not done so already. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll catch you in my next video.